All right, so if you want to go ahead and turn, you can go to Genesis chapter 22. We'll get there in a couple minutes. So obviously we'll be teaching the youth, but where do we begin to give them the knowledge they need? We all start from Proverbs 1, verse 7, and it says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge." This gets misinterpreted because people think fear here, the word fear here in this verse means to be afraid of God, but that's not it. The fear of the Lord means that we love him so much that we're afraid. I also like using the word here, terrified. That we are terrified to be away from him. All right, just to ask you a question. Why would you want to be in a relationship with somebody that you're scared of? I wouldn't be married to her if I was scared of her. So
Good to know.
I don't know if I'd want to work here at Covenant if I was scared of everybody who's on staff. So I'm looking around.
He's only a little scared of Pastor Roy.
Yeah, Pastor.
Just a healthy amount of scaredness.
Only because he's my boss and I have to go to him for everything. So that's the only. No. I believe I've overcome that fear. So
he was set free.
It used to be a lot worse, but. No.
Roy's lighting up on him a little bit, I guess.
So some people take what they see the fear of the Lord is and turn it into some kind of religion. They become so afraid of God being angry that they lose sight of his love. Although that's not the case, obedience is still a factor when it comes to the fear of the Lord.
I think one thing that we talked about a little bit right there was just that you can take the fear of the Lord to such an extreme that it becomes, what, I can't mess up. I can't, I'm just going to get struck by lightning. God's just going to smite me. And I think that we get the wrong interpretation of the fear of the Lord. And so what Christian was sharing with me is that even though that's not the case, obedience is still vital. It's still vital to the fear of the Lord, but we're not so terrified of God and what he's going to do to us. We're just terrified of being separate from him, of anything that could keep us separate from him.
Awesome. So, as I said, we're going to go into Genesis chapter 22. This is, I believe, is a very familiar scripture here. I'm not going to read it all, just kind of go along and go through it here. Verses 1 and 2, though, I'm going to go ahead and read. It says, "Sometime later, God tested Abraham's faith. 'Abraham,' God called. 'Yes,' he replied, 'here I am. Take your son, your only son, yes, Isaac, whom you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I will show you.'" Here, so Abraham was told what to do and where to go, of course, to sacrifice Isaac here. And then verse 3, I love verse 3 here. It says, "The next morning Abraham got up early." Another version of this says, "early the next morning." So here we see that Abraham obeyed God instantly. And Abraham knew what he had to do, even if it meant killing his son, Isaac, who he waited for years for Isaac to come. No hesitation, he just did it. He had to think about that all night too, and also the next 3 days while he traveled to the place where he was going to sacrifice. He also obeyed so we have to obey even if it doesn't make sense. So Abraham waited for Isaac that long, and it was God's promise to him. And the knowledge of sacrificing him made Abraham hurt as well.
Yeah, it wasn't that he was just like, "Oh, joy, I get to sacrifice my son." He acted in immediate obedience, but his heart, I'm sure, was aching. And I think that it's really interesting, too, that one thing we talked about when we were looking over our notes and kind of planning things out was the fact that it does specifically say that the next morning he got up early and made plans to obey. If God had told me to do something like that, I guarantee you I probably would have slept in, dilly-dallied around, I would have made every excuse to delay what it was that God had spoken to me to do if I knew that it was going to cost me something that was so valuable. And God asked him to give the most precious gift that he had longed and ached for years. And now God's asking him to sacrifice it. And he's going to talk in a minute about just the faith that he had in doing that. But I just think as a parent, and, as a parent who didn't struggle and wait and agonize for years to have my children, I still can't even imagine, I would have been laying awake that whole night, knowing what was about to take place. And then getting up in the morning, I probably would have drugged my feet. But just like he mentioned, he got up early the next day, started making preparations for his obedience. And then he had to travel 3 days and agonize over it. Could you imagine? Just playing that and replaying it in your mind over and over again. And so he had ample time to just disobey God and to walk away. He had plenty of opportunity to think about this enough that he was willing to say, I'm not doing it. I'm not going there.
So he also had to go through extensive lengths to obey this one radical thing God had commanded him to do and told him to do. All right, verse 7. It says, Isaac turned to Abraham and said, Father. Yes, my son, Abraham replied. We have the fire and the wood, the boy said, but the sheep for the burnt offering. But where is the sheep for the burnt offering? So we see the words we here, and then...
But you didn't read the next one.
Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, God will, verse 8, God will provide a sheep for the burnt offering. My son, Abraham answered, and they both walked on together. So we see we see the words we, and then also him believing for the sheep. He was believing for the sheep to come.
And just the use of the word we're going to come back, we together are going to come back. And him just saying God's going to provide it. He already knew what God had instructed him to do. But he had enough faith that God was, I think he had enough faith that either God was going to provide a sheep or that if he did sacrifice Isaac, he would raise it back up from the dead, because he just trusted that this was God's promise and he was willing to lay it down for him. But he really had faith that God was going to really just intervene. Even though it was God's command, he trusted that God had a good plan, and that even though this didn't sound so good, he trusted that we're going to come back off this mountain together.
All right. Move on verse 9. It says, when they arrived at the place where they had told him to go, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood on it. Then he tied up his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice. At that moment, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Yes, Abraham replied, here I am. Verse 12, don't lay a hand on the boy, the angel said. Do not hurt him in any way, for now I know that you truly fear God. You have not withheld from me even your son, your only son. So here we see Abraham obeyed God to completion. The proof of his holy fear and faith was obedience. And I like what it says in James chapter 2, verse 23. You don't have to turn there. It says, and so it happened, just as the scriptures say, Abraham believed God, and God counted him as righteous because of his faith. He was even called a friend of God. So James even points out here that out of Abraham's obedience, resulted in friendship with God. And then in Psalms 25, verse 14, it says, God is a friend to those who fear him.
Yeah, so the thing that was really beautiful about this story is, we've a lot of us, if you're here on a Sunday night, most likely you've been in the Lord for a little while, or you've studied a little bit. Not everybody, though. Maybe this is your first time hearing this story. I used to be that person that sat in church when everybody was like, everybody knows this story. And I was one like, not me. But most of you guys are probably familiar with this story. You guys know of the sacrifice. But what I love is that whenever he was like getting fired up when we were talking about our notes about this story, because he was like, I just love so much that he was so dedicated to reverencing the Lord. He was so dedicated to honoring what God asked him to do. He was willing to be radical in his obedience. And in the way that James says it there, when James references what Abraham did in his sacrifice, and he says, because of his obedience, he was called a friend of God. Because of his obedience, he was radically obedient. He had the fear of the Lord, and he was called the friend of God. Now, when Christian kind of explained in the beginning that fear of the Lord is not that we're so afraid of what he might do to us, but that we love him so much, we have a huge understanding of his blessing in our life that we are terrified to be away from it. Is anybody else terrified to be away from God? I know what it's like to not have a relationship with Jesus. I know what it felt like to walk in the world. I know what it felt like to walk in darkness. I don't want to be there. I don't want to be separated from him. And having the understanding that disobedience and sin and those things in my life that I don't want to be fully obedient and are putting this barrier between me and God, that should terrify me a little bit. Not in a way that I feel like condemnation or fear that I can't approach God, but just that I long for him so desperately that I don't want to do anything that would keep me away from his presence. Not that I'm scared of him, but that I'm just in such awe of him, that he is so incredible and so amazing to me. And Abraham was so sold out to this knowledge of how awesome and holy that God was, that he was willing to give the most precious thing so he wouldn't be separate from how awesome God was. And what happened as a result of that was that God made the perfect provision for that, and also that God counted him as a friend because of that radical obedience. And one thing we talked about too is that in our relationship, there are things that I do for him, not because I'm afraid he's going to hit me if I don't do them, but I do them because I know that they make him happy. I know that he's never said, if you don't cook me dinner, woman. Never once. I don't even know that he has ever asked me to cook dinner. I just always do it. I should reconsider. No, I'm just kidding.
Her food's delicious.
Oh, thank you. I am an okay cook. Anyway, but I know that when he's been here working all day, that he's probably hungry when he gets home. And so I try to make him a decent dinner every night on the table. And that's not because I'm afraid he's going to come home and slap me if I don't, but because I love him so much that I want to do something to make his life easier. If he can come home after a long day of work and sit down to a hot meal and not have to think about what he's going to eat, and that's going to make his evening a little smoother, then I'm going to do it. Not because I'm scared of him, but because I love him. And it's kind of similar to that. I have such a great awe and understanding that I want to be in such an intimate place with the Lord that it's not that I'm scared he's going to smite me if I don't do something, but because I want to honor him in everything that I do. Because I love him so much that just oozes out of my heart. Am I perfect in it all the time? No. But I really strive to walk in obedience as closely as I can, not only because I want to make him happy, but because I desire to be a friend of God. And so the second part of this is that whenever you walk in the fear of the Lord, it creates a holy intimacy with you and the Father that cannot be made any other way. One thing I think is a little sad that you can kind of see on both ends of the spectrum in Christian church is you've got people on one end that are so afraid of God that they turn it into such a stiff religion. They're afraid to move a muscle. They're afraid that they're going to mess up. They're so terrified of God in the wrong kind of way that they won't pursue a relationship with him. Just like Christian said, why would I pursue a relationship with somebody that I'm scared of? But on the opposite end, you've got some people that are so in their feelings, and they really feel like, I hate to say that, they feel like they're in this close relationship with God, but really it's all based on feelings, and none of it's based on obedience or sacrifice or this holy awe and reverence of this holy, awesome God. And so we find ourselves looking at these two ends of the spectrum, but realizing that both of these pieces are needed. And so one thing I want you guys to know is that this holy reverence, this fear of the Lord, it's the beginning of knowledge, but it is the key to intimacy with God. It is the key to intimacy with God. So I want you guys to go to Psalm 19. There it is. Okay. And we're going to start in verse number 7. And here's what the first portion of this says. It says, "The instructions of the Lord are perfect, reviving the soul. The decrees of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. The commandments of the Lord are right, bringing joy to the heart. The commandments of the Lord are clear, giving insight for living. Reverence for the Lord is pure, lasting forever. The laws of the Lord are true, each one is fair. They are more desirable than gold, even the finest gold. They are sweeter than honey, even honey dripping from the comb. They are a warning to your servant, a great reward for those who obey him." Okay, stop just a second. So the psalmist David here is just talking about the instruction of the Lord, the command of the Lord, and he has a lot of really rich and beautiful terminology here to explain his heart towards the commands of God. And when we look at the instruction and the commands of God, and we look at our attitude towards walking after those things in obedience, sometimes we can get on that one side of the spectrum where we look at it with such this harsh, like, the commands of God are so strict and God just, hates us all and he'd rather not put up with us. But really what this is saying is, I'm seeing words like joy. I'm seeing words that are pure. They're giving insight. They're true. They're more desirable than gold. They're sweeter than honey. So he's setting up to say, these things, in walking in obedience to his word that does have maybe some hard things for us to obey sometimes, some things that feel a little difficult. This word is sweeter and richer than anything that we could want, right? So he's talking about having this. It says the reverence for the Lord is pure, lasting forever, and the laws of the Lord are true. Each one is fair. Acknowledging that even though the things might seem hard, they're fair, but in this reverence, it is just rich, and it is full, and it is awesome. Now, continuing on is where this is where he's talking about the fear of the Lord, the rules, the commands, the word, okay? But this next portion we're going to read, I feel like, is where he gets into the talk of the intimacy. So next he says in verse 12, "How can I know all the sins lurking in my heart? Cleanse me from these hidden faults. Keep your servant from deliberate sins. Don't let them control me. Then I will be free of guilt and innocent of great sin. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer." So he goes from talking about this holy instruction, which some people make that feel so fearful. I'm so fearful of the commands. I'm so fearful to not, get everything perfectly right that I'm over here in religion. But he has these two things so combined that he goes straight from honoring the commands and just reverencing the Lord to this point that this is so beautiful and so important to me that now in my heart, what I can say is, Lord, just purify me. And he goes into this intimate place of worship and of prayer where he says, God, let anything in me that's not pleasing, anything that keeps me from you, anything that's not satisfying in my heart, remove that thing from me so I can be in your presence. I love the last line. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be pleasing to you. May all of this stuff that I like to keep hidden, let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart. I was at a conference last weekend, and the one thing that was said that has been replaying in my mind all week was that intimacy means see into me. See into me. And if you think about that, just intimacy with another person, you're allowing that other person to see a part of you that you don't let anybody else see. And so if you're really truly walking in intimacy with the Lord, it doesn't mean that he doesn't already know. He knows the junk of your heart without you having to tell him. But when you come into this place, of awe and fear that moves you to the point that you want to be intimate with God and say, God, look into me. Look into my heart, because I am so terrified of what it would be like to be outside of your presence that I want you to see into me See into me anything that doesn't please you. See into me that anything that doesn't align with this command that is so holy and so precious. See into me and remove that thing. Let the words I speak, let the things my heart meditates on, let those be things that are pleasing to you, Lord. And I just love that he just kind of pairs those two things, the word, the obedience, the fear, and the awe. And that just transforms David's heart into saying, because I know how rich your word is, please, Lord, examine my heart. Take away those things that are sinful. Take away those things that aren't pleasing to you. But you have to be in a comfortable place with God. I need to feel like I can come to the Lord with that openness to know that there's probably going to be some things in there that aren't pleasing to God. If I'm really honest and I'm really opening that up, I have to be okay with God pointing those things out. But if I'm coming to him in an awe and reverence and understanding of how awesome he is, in radical obedience in that, knowing that he's calling me a friend, that even though his correction might be difficult, it is so worth it. It is so worth it to have God speak to my heart the things that I need to change so I can be more like him. And one thing I want to just talk about too is that that fear of the Lord is the foundation of intimacy. So you can't have one without the other. I can't truly be intimate with God without the fear of him, of knowing that. And it all just kind of ties together. Just as Abraham was called a friend of God after he walked in obedience, Pastor Sheldon actually referenced the chapter this morning, John chapter 15, where Jesus, I don't know if you even quite got to that part, but it talks about how he said, now you're my friend. You are my friend. You abide in me and I abide in you. John chapter 15 is probably my favorite chapter of the Bible. I love it. I could read it over and over again because it's just the core, I feel like, of our relationship with God. Just abiding, just being in that intimate place with God, that I just want to be in him. And in him is where I know that I'm going to be safe, I'm going to be secure, but where I'm also going to be called out on the hard things in my heart that I'm willing to open up to him. One more place I'm going to have you guys go, Psalm 63. And here's another kind of prayer of intimacy that I love to read the scripture. And some of these, maybe if you're like, I don't really even know what to say. If you want to pray Psalm 19 and then this one, Psalm 63, these are good places to start and just opening yourself up, meditating on these scriptures. So this one says, "O God, you are my God. I earnestly search for you. My soul thirsts for you. My whole body longs for you in this parched and weary land where there is no water. I have seen you in your sanctuary and gazed upon your power and glory. Your unfailing love is better than life itself. How I praise you. I will praise you as long as I live, lifting up holy hands to you in prayer. You satisfy me more than the richest feast. I will praise you with songs of joy. I lie awake thinking of you, meditating on you through the night, because you are my helper. I sing for joy in the shadow of your wings. I cling to you. Your strong right hand holds me securely." And that passage is just beautiful to me, because just the way that he describes the way that he is yearning for the Lord is just from such an intimate place. Just an intimate heart attitude, that some of the ways that he describes his longing for God, like, my whole body longs for you. You ever felt that ache? Like, God, I just want you. Like, that's all that's going to be worthwhile in this moment is you. And I love that he even says, I've seen you in your sanctuary and I've gazed upon your power and your glory. Maybe there's some of you who have been in this sanctuary and you've gazed upon his power and his glory. Maybe you've seen it from afar. You've watched somebody else encounter it. But maybe you haven't entered into that place yourself. And you can meditate in your heart and say, God, I've gazed upon your power. I know what you're capable of doing. But at this time, I haven't entered my heart into a place where I'm vulnerable enough to receive that. Because if I'm not willing to be vulnerable, if I'm not willing to surrender in that place, you can come stand at the altar and sway back and forth all you want to, but until your heart's in a place that you can be vulnerable and be open with what God's wanting to do in your life, you're only going to gaze upon the power and glory of what God's able to do. But I don't know about you guys, but I'm not satisfied just sitting back and gazing. My whole body yearns for you. I'm so hungry for your presence. I want to be with you. And nothing else. I love that it says, you satisfy me more than the richest feast. I like to eat. But nothing satisfies me more than being in the presence of Jesus. He is rich and satisfying in every area and every way. So as we were kind of sharing and talking about tonight, he so strongly had this fear of the Lord, awe, reverence, obedience thing. And I just had one word: intimacy. And the more we started talking and realizing how interwoven those things are, we started thinking about how even just understanding this simplicity is a really good foundation to lay upon your entire walk with the Lord. If you understand his greatness enough that you've called upon him for salvation, then you already have some form of a fear or an awe or a reverence of the Lord. Because you understand, okay, he's creator, I need him, I have a need for him, or I would not be saved. So we want you to kind of transform the way you think about the fear of God. You have anything to add? I feel like I've been talking for quite a few minutes on my own here. But we want you guys to transform the way that you think about the fear of God. Because if you think about it as this God that's just going to strike me, then you lose that deep, intimate place. One thing that I know is that God's thoughts are higher than my thoughts. His ways are higher than my ways. He understands things. And even when I think I'm doing good, he sees parts of my heart that need to be transformed. And I want to be in that place where I'm willing to be vulnerable, where I'm willing to be open, where I'm willing to say, even though, God, I know that you know that's there. I know that he already sees everything, guys. No amount of hiding it and polishing it up and putting on your Sunday best over top of it hides the longings of your heart that can only be filled by Jesus. No part of that does. But whenever we stand back and we say, I have such a need for you, but that doesn't push me away from your holiness, it draws me to it. Because in that place of holiness, when I can call upon my friend that sticks closer than any brother, is when I'm really able to find that intimacy and be in that place of vulnerability.